My name is Sarah Mitchell, and 3 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. I was sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Whitmore and Associates, the most prestigious law firm in downtown Chicago, watching my stepmother Patricia flip through a leather-bound document with perfectly manicured nails. Her Chanel suit was pristine, her blonde hair pulled back in that signature chignon that screamed old money. But her eyes held something I'd never seen before. Pure, calculated malice. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said, not looking sorry at all. "But your father was very clear about his final wishes. The will has been updated." The words hit me like a physical blow. Updated? My father, James Mitchell, had died just 2 weeks earlier from a sudden heart attack. We'd barely finished the funeral arrangements, and here she was, talking about updates to his will like she was discussing the weather. "What do you mean, updated?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. Patricia's lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, slid a document across the polished table. "Miss Mitchell, I'm afraid your name has been removed from your father's will. All assets, including the family business, the estate in Lake Forest, and the investment portfolio, have been left entirely to Mrs. Patricia Mitchell." The room started spinning. Removed? How do you just remove someone from a will? I'd been my father's only child for 32 years. We'd built Mitchell Construction together from the ground up after I graduated from Northwestern. He'd always told me I was his legacy, his pride and joy. "This can't be right," I stammered, reaching for the document. "Dad would never—" "Oh, but he would," Patricia interrupted, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You see, Sarah, your father was quite disappointed in your recent choices. Your divorce, your decision to move back home, the way you've been handling the business accounts. He felt you weren't mature enough to handle such responsibility." Every word was a knife twisting deeper. My divorce from Marcus had been devastating enough. Discovering your husband's affair with his secretary tends to do that to a person. But my father had been supportive, hadn't he? He'd welcomed me back home, given me space to heal. "James was very concerned about your emotional stability," the lawyer added, adjusting his glasses. "The will was changed just 6 months ago, with proper witnesses and notarization, of course." 6 months ago. Right around the time Patricia had started suggesting I needed professional help to deal with my divorce. Right around the time she'd started having those private conversations with my father behind closed doors. I looked at Patricia, really looked at her, and saw something that made my blood run cold. She was enjoying this. Every second of my pain, every moment of my shock, she was savoring it like fine wine. "There must be something I can do," I said, hating how desperate I sounded. "Some way to contest this?" The lawyer shook his head. "The will is ironclad, Miss Mitchell. Unless you can prove mental incapacity or undue influence, which would be extremely difficult, given the circumstances." Patricia leaned back in her chair, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw the triumphant gleam in her eyes, the slight upturn of her lips. She'd won, and she knew it. "I am sorry, dear," she said, her voice returning to that saccharine tone. "But perhaps this is for the best. You can start fresh now, make your own way in the world. Isn't that what young people want these days? Independence?" Young people. I was 32 years old, and she was treating me like a child who'd been caught stealing cookies. But as I sat there, watching her gather up the papers that had just stolen my entire future, I felt something shift inside me. Something cold and calculating that I'd inherited from my father. Something Patricia had clearly underestimated. Because what Patricia didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that I hadn't just been handling the business accounts these past 6 months. I'd been preparing for something entirely different, something that was about to turn her perfect little victory into the biggest mistake of her life. But first, I had to play the part of the devastated daughter just a little bit longer. The next few weeks were a masterclass in humiliation. Patricia wasted no time establishing her new role as the queen of the Mitchell Empire. She moved into my father's study, rearranged the furniture in the Lake Forest mansion, and started making changes to Mitchell Construction that would have made my father roll over in his grave. I was allowed to stay in the house. How generous of her, but only in the small guest room above the garage, the room I'd used as a teenager when I was grounded. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. "Just until you find your own place, of course," Patricia had said with that smile that never reached her eyes. I know this is all very difficult for you, but we must move forward. Moving forward, apparently, meant watching her parade through town like she'd always been a Mitchell. She joined the country club board, something my father had never allowed her to do. She started hosting dinner parties in the dining room where I'd celebrated every birthday for the first 18 years of my life. She even had the audacity to redecorate my father's bedroom, removing every trace of him like he'd never existed. But the worst part was watching her destroy everything my father had built. Mitchell Construction had been a family business for 3 generations. We specialized in historic renovations, taking old buildings and bringing them back to life with respect for their original character. It was painstaking work that required skill, patience, and integrity. Patricia saw it as inefficient. We could make so much more money with new construction, she told the foreman, Bill Hendricks, who'd worked for my father for over 20 years. All this fussy restoration work takes too long. Time is money, gentlemen. I watched from my exile above the garage as she fired 3 of our most experienced craftsmen and replaced them with a cheap crew that specialized in quick flips. She started bidding on projects that were completely outside our expertise, promising impossible timelines to clients who didn't know any better. Sarah used to handle these accounts, I heard her tell a potential client over the phone. But she's been unstable since her divorce. Couldn't trust her with the financial details anymore. Women and numbers, you know how it is. Women and numbers. I had an MBA from Kellogg and had increased the company's profits by 30% in the 2 years before my father's death. But sure, Patricia. Women and numbers. The phone calls were the hardest part. Friends, colleagues, even some of my father's oldest business partners would call the house. And Patricia would answer with that perfectly modulated voice. "Oh, Sarah." She's taking some time to process her grief. Yes, it's been very hard on her. The doctors think she needs some space to work through her emotional issues. You know how close she was to James. Emotional issues. Like grief was a character defect. Like mourning, my father made me mentally unstable. She never let me take the calls. "I don't think you're ready for that kind of stress yet, dear," she'd say, hanging up the phone before I could protest. "People understand. They know you're going through a difficult time." The isolation was deliberate and complete. She'd poisoned every relationship I had, every professional connection, every friendship, and she did it all with that concerned, caring tone that made her sound like the world's most devoted stepmother. But what really broke my heart was watching her erase my father's memory. The photos of us together, at my college graduation, at construction sites, at company Christmas parties, they all disappeared from the mantelpiece. In their place, she put pictures of herself with my father, carefully curated moments from their 5-year marriage that painted her as the grieving widow and loving wife. The worst was the photo she'd placed on his desk in the study. It showed the 2 of them at some charity gala, my father in his best suit, Patricia in a glittering silver gown. They looked happy, successful, like the perfect power couple. You'd never know that just outside the frame, I'd been standing there too, in the navy dress my father had bought me for the occasion. She'd cropped me out completely. 3 months. That's how long it took her to completely rewrite the history of the Mitchell family. 3 months to erase 32 years of my life, my relationship with my father, my place in the world. But Patricia had made one crucial mistake in her masterful manipulation. She'd assumed that because I'd been quiet, because I'd played the role of the grieving, unstable daughter, that I was actually broken. She'd mistaken my silence for defeat. What she didn't realize was that I'd been busy during those 3 months of humiliation. Very busy indeed. And every time she thought she'd pushed me a little further into the ground, she was actually digging her own grave a little deeper. Have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who thought they had you figured out? Sometimes that's exactly where you want to be. The explosion came on a Tuesday morning in March, and it started with a phone call that made Patricia's perfectly composed face crack like fine china. I was in the kitchen, making my morning coffee in what had once been my home, when I heard her voice from the study. She was supposed to be taking a business call, but something was wrong. Her tone was sharp, desperate, nothing like the controlled, condescending voice she'd used with me for months. "What do you mean, irregularities?" she was saying. "I don't understand what you're talking about." I moved closer to the door, coffee mug in hand, my heart starting to race. Through the crack, I could see her pacing behind my father's desk, her usually perfect hair disheveled. No, that's impossible, she continued, her voice rising. The prenup clearly states, what do you mean it's not valid? Prenup. My blood turned to ice water. I need to see those documents immediately, Patricia was saying now, her voice taking on that dangerous edge I'd learned to recognize. There has to be some mistake, but there was no mistake. And as I stood there in the hallway of my childhood home, listening to Patricia's world begin to crumble, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Because Patricia had made a fatal error in her calculations. She'd been so focused on erasing me from my father's will that she'd never thought to check the other legal documents that governed her marriage. Documents that I'd had a very intimate role in creating. You see, 5 years ago, when my father first announced his engagement to Patricia, I'd been the one to suggest they needed a prenuptial agreement. I'd seen what happened to business owners who didn't protect their assets, and I wasn't about to let some young woman, she was only 8 years older than me, walk away with half of everything my family had built. Patricia had been furious about the prenup, of course. She'd cried, she'd pleaded, she'd accused my father of not trusting her, but I'd been insistent, and my father had listened to me. He'd always listened to me when it came to business and legal matters. What Patricia didn't know was that I hadn't just suggested the prenup. I'd written it. Every clause, every condition, every carefully crafted sentence that would protect the Mitchell family assets. I'd worked with our family attorney, Marcus Klein, ironically the same lawyer who'd handled my own divorce, to create an ironclad document that would ensure Patricia could never touch the core Mitchell holdings. The prenup was brilliant, if I do say so myself. It stipulated that in the event of my father's death, Patricia would receive a generous settlement, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but the family business, the estate, and the majority of the investment portfolio would remain in Mitchell hands, specifically in my hands as the sole Mitchell heir. But here's where it gets really interesting. The prenup also contained a clause that I'd insisted on after watching too many episodes of true crime documentaries with my father. If Patricia was found to have manipulated or coerced my father into changing his will in a way that contradicted the prenuptial agreement, the entire settlement would be voided. She'd get nothing, absolutely nothing. I'd thought I was being paranoid when I added that clause. My father had laughed, called me his little lawyer, and said I watched too much TV, but he'd signed it anyway, because he trusted my judgment. Now, listening to Patricia's increasingly frantic phone conversation, I realized that my paranoia had been perfectly justified. There has to be a way around this, she was saying now, her voice barely controlled. The will supersedes the prenup, doesn't it? That's how inheritance law works. But that's not how inheritance law works when there's evidence of fraud. And as Patricia was about to discover, I'd been collecting evidence for months. Every conversation where she'd badmouthed me to my father, every lie she'd told about my mental state, every document she'd hidden from me, every phone call she'd made to the lawyer about updating the will. I'd been recording it all, storing it all, preparing for exactly this moment. The phone call ended with Patricia slamming the receiver down so hard I heard it from the kitchen. A few seconds later, I heard her screaming, actually screaming, a sound of pure rage and frustration that made me smile for the first time in months. You see, Patricia had played her game perfectly, but she'd been playing by the wrong rules. She'd focused all her attention on the will, never realizing that the prenup was the real power document. She'd manipulated my father into changing his final wishes, but she'd never been able to touch the contract she'd signed on her wedding day. The contract that I'd written specifically to protect everything she'd just tried to steal. As I stood there, listening to Patricia's world implode, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I'd been the victim, the grieving daughter, the woman who'd lost everything. But that was about to change, because Patricia was about to discover that when you try to destroy a Mitchell, you better make sure you finish the job. Otherwise, we have a tendency to rise from the ashes stronger than before. And I was just getting started. The next morning, Patricia was gone. Not just out for the day, gone. Her clothes, her jewelry, her collection of crystal figurines that had cluttered my father's once tasteful mantelpiece, all of it had vanished sometime between midnight and dawn. The only trace she'd left behind was a half-empty bottle of champagne on the kitchen counter and a note with 2 words scrawled in her perfect handwriting, "You win." But I wasn't celebrating yet. I knew Patricia better than that. She didn't give up easily, and she certainly didn't run away without a fight. This felt more like a strategic retreat than a surrender. I was right to be suspicious. The call came 3 days later from Marcus Klein, our family attorney. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger when he told me that Patricia had filed a lawsuit challenging the prenup. She was claiming that my father had been mentally compromised when he signed it, that I'd manipulated an elderly man into protecting assets that should rightfully belong to his wife. She's hired Thompson and Associates, Marcus told me, referring to the most aggressive litigation firm in Chicago. They're claiming undue influence, elder abuse, and fraud. Sarah, this could get very ugly. Ugly? I almost laughed. Patricia had stolen my inheritance, destroyed my reputation, isolated me from everyone I'd ever cared about. And now she was worried about things getting ugly. But I understood her strategy. If she could prove that the prenup was invalid, the will would stand as written. She'd get everything, and I'd be left with nothing but legal bills and a ruined reputation. It was a good plan. It might have even worked if she'd been dealing with anyone else. Marcus, I said, settling into my father's leather chair in the study, I need you to file a countersuit. I'm challenging the will on grounds of fraud and undue influence. Sarah, we've been through this. The will is solid. James was of sound mind when— Was he? I interrupted, opening the bottom drawer of my father's desk, because I have some very interesting recordings that suggest otherwise. What I pulled out of that drawer was the culmination of 6 months of careful planning. A small digital recorder, no bigger than a matchbook, that I'd hidden in the study the day after my father's funeral. I'd known Patricia would use this room to make her business calls, to meet with lawyers, to plan whatever scheme she was cooking up. I'd recorded everything. Patricia's conversations with her lawyer about manipulating my father's will. Her phone calls to his doctor, asking about medications that might affect his judgment. Her meetings with the accountant, where she'd lied about my mental state and my handling of the business finances. But the most damning recording was a conversation she'd had with her sister Linda just 2 weeks after my father's death. Patricia had been drunk. I could hear it in her voice. And she'd been bragging about how easy it had been to convince my father that I was unstable. He was so worried about Sarah after the divorce. Patricia's voice crackled through the speaker. All I had to do was plant a few seeds about her emotional state, maybe exaggerate a few incidents. You know how men are. They see a woman cry a few times, and suddenly she's having a nervous breakdown. Linda's response was equally damning. But what if she finds out? What if she challenges the will? She won't. Patricia had laughed. She's too broken, too defeated, and even if she tries, who's going to believe her? The mentally unstable daughter versus the grieving widow? Please. I'd sat in that study for hours after first hearing that recording, feeling a cold rage settle in my bones. Patricia hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd systematically destroyed my father's final months, poisoning his relationship with me, making him doubt the daughter he'd loved and trusted for 32 years. But now, as I played the recording for Marcus, I watched his expression change from concern to amazement, to something that looked almost like admiration. "Jesus, Sarah," he said when the recording ended. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day I heard her talking to you about updating the will," I replied. I knew something was wrong, but I needed proof, so I got it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then he started to smile. "This changes everything. Not only can we prove she manipulated the will, but we can show a pattern of fraud going back months. The prenup will stand, and she'll lose everything. Everything." The word tasted sweeter than I'd expected, but I still wasn't done. Because Patricia had taught me something valuable during those months of humiliation. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. And Patricia had shown me that she was willing to destroy lives to get what she wanted. So I was going to return the favor. Over the next week, I systematically undid every change Patricia had made to Mitchell Construction. I rehired the craftsmen she'd fired, canceled the contracts she'd signed for projects we had no business taking on, and called every client she'd alienated to explain that there had been some management changes. I also reached out to every friend and colleague she'd lied to, playing them carefully selected portions of the recordings that showed exactly what she'd been saying about me behind my back. Within days, Patricia's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. But the best part was watching her reputation in the community implode. The country club board meetings where she'd held court, They suddenly didn't want her anymore. The charity organizations where she'd positioned herself as the grieving widow, they started questioning her motives. The social circles she'd tried so hard to infiltrate, they closed ranks against her faster than she could say, "Mitchell." Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply letting people see who someone really is. Have you ever watched someone's carefully built facade just collapse? There's something almost poetic about it. 6 months later, I was sitting in that same mahogany-paneled office at Whitmore and Associates, but this time the roles were reversed. Patricia sat across from me, her perfect composure finally cracked, her Chanel suit replaced with something off the rack that didn't quite fit right. Her lawyer, not the prestigious firm she'd hired, but a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shuffled through papers with the resigned air of someone who knew they'd already lost. The judge had ruled in my favor on every count. The will was invalidated due to fraud and undue influence. The prenup stood as written. Patricia's countersuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never file another claim against the Mitchell estate. She would receive exactly what I'd specified in that contract I'd written 5 years ago. Nothing. But that wasn't even the best part. The best part was watching Patricia realize that her financial troubles were just beginning. Because when you commit fraud to steal someone's inheritance, you don't just lose the inheritance, you become liable for all the damages you caused in the process. The business contracts she'd bungled were going to cost Mitchell Construction nearly $200,000 in penalties and lost revenue. The craftsmen she'd fired had filed wrongful termination suits. The clients she'd alienated were demanding compensation for projects that had to be completely redone. And guess who was legally responsible for all of it? The person who'd been acting as the fraudulent executor of the estate, Patricia. The total damages come to approximately $847,000, Marcus announced to the room, his voice professionally neutral but his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Mrs. Mitchell will be personally liable for the full amount. I watched Patricia's face go white. $847,000. More money than she'd probably ever seen in her life, certainly more than she could pay. Her carefully planned future of living off my father's wealth had just turned into a lifetime of debt. But I wasn't done yet. "There's one more thing," I said, reaching into my briefcase. "I've been in touch with the Illinois State Bar Association about your attorney's conduct during this case." Patricia's lawyer looked up sharply. "I'm sorry, what?" "The recordings I submitted as evidence included several conversations where you advised Mrs. Mitchell on how to better manipulate my father's mental state to ensure the will changes would hold up in court. That constitutes conspiracy to commit fraud and elder abuse." The color drained from the lawyer's face. A complaint to the state bar could end his career, and we all knew it. "You see," I continued, enjoying every second of this moment, "when you try to destroy someone's life, you should probably make sure you're not creating evidence of your own crimes in the process." Patricia finally spoke, her voice a broken whisper. "What do you want?" What did I want? For months, I'd thought I wanted revenge. I'd wanted to see her suffer the way she'd made me suffer. I'd wanted her to lose everything the way I'd lost everything. But sitting there, looking at this woman who'd tried so hard to erase me from my own family's history, I realized that revenge wasn't enough. I wanted something more powerful than that. I wanted justice. "I want you to disappear," I said quietly. "Leave Chicago. Change your name if you want to. Start over somewhere else. But if you ever come back, if you ever try to contact anyone in my family's circle, if you ever even think about challenging this settlement again, I will make sure that every recording I have of you gets played on every news station in the city." I leaned forward, letting her see the steel in my eyes that she'd so badly underestimated. "You thought you could erase Sarah Mitchell from the world. But here's what you never understood. Mitchells don't disappear. We don't break. And we sure as hell don't let anyone steal our legacy without a fight." Patricia nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of grief or remorse, tears of defeat. She'd played the game perfectly, but she'd forgotten the most important rule: never underestimate your opponent. As I walked out of that office, the deed to the Lake Forest mansion in my hand, the keys to Mitchell Construction in my pocket, and my father's legacy finally restored, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year: peace. But more than that, I felt proud. Proud of the woman I'd become through this ordeal. proud of the strength I'd found when everything was taken from me. Proud of the fact that I'd fought back not with manipulation or lies, but with truth and evidence and the legal system working exactly as it should. 3 years later, Mitchell Construction is thriving. We've expanded into sustainable building practices, and we're about to open a second location in Milwaukee. I've started a foundation in my father's name that provides legal aid to families dealing with inheritance fraud. And Patricia? I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Arizona and works at a call center under a different name. Sometimes karma doesn't need any help. It just needs time to work. You know what the real victory was? It wasn't getting my inheritance back or seeing Patricia lose everything. It was realizing that no one, absolutely no one, can erase who you are unless you let them. Your worth isn't determined by what's written in a will or what people say about you when you're not in the room. It's determined by what you do when everything is on the line and everyone has counted you out. So if you're going through something similar, if someone is trying to rewrite your story or steal what's rightfully yours, remember this: the truth has a funny way of surfacing eventually. And when it does, make sure you're ready. If stories like this remind you that justice isn't always immediate, but it's always possible, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? I read every single comment, and trust me, your story matters too.